She laughed at the homeless man in front of everyone. But 30 minutes later, she was on her knees begging for forgiveness. On a cold, rainy evening in downtown Chicago, the glowing lights of La Belle Maison, one of the city's most luxurious restaurants, reflected across the wet pavement. Inside, wealthy guests sipped expensive wine, laughed over candlelit tables, and enjoyed five-star meals. And standing at the front entrance was Vanessa Carter, elegant, powerful, and feared by everyone who worked there. Vanessa owned the restaurant. She was known for her beauty, her wealth, and her cruel attitude toward anyone she considered beneath her. That night, she stood at the entrance greeting VIP guests for an exclusive charity gala. Everything had to be perfect, until she noticed him, an elderly homeless man slowly approaching the entrance. His gray coat was soaked from the rain, his shoes were torn. His beard was unkempt, and his hands trembled from the freezing wind. He looked exhausted, hungry, and desperate. The man stopped at the entrance and looked up at Vanessa. In a weak voice, he said, "Excuse me, ma'am. Could I please come inside for just a few minutes? I only need warmth. And maybe a little food." The guests nearby turned to stare. Vanessa's expression twisted into disgust. Then she laughed, not a nervous laugh. A cold, mocking laugh, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at you," she sneered. "This is not a shelter. Do you even know how much one plate here costs?" Some guests chuckled awkwardly. The old man lowered his head, but he remained calm. "I'm not asking for luxury," he said softly, "only kindness." That only made Vanessa angrier. She stepped closer and pointed toward the street. "Kindness?" She smirked. "People like you always want handouts. Leave before I call security." The old man looked into her eyes for a long moment, and then he said something that made no sense at the time. "Be careful how you treat people, Miss Carter. Sometimes, the person you reject is the one holding your future." Vanessa burst into laughter. "My future?" She snapped her fingers at security. "Throw him out." The guards shoved the old man back into the pouring rain. He stumbled, nearly falling, but before walking away, he looked back at the restaurant one final time and smiled. 30 minutes later, everything changed. Inside the restaurant, the charity gala was reaching its peak. A major investor was expected to arrive. This deal was worth $20 million. It would make Vanessa's restaurant empire expand nationwide. She was nervous but confident. Then the front doors opened, and the entire room fell silent. A fleet of black luxury cars had arrived outside. Security straightened instantly. Every guest turned to watch. Vanessa smiled, expecting the famous investor, but when the man stepped through the doorway, her smile vanished. It was him, the homeless man, except now, he was wearing a perfectly tailored black suit. His gray hair was neatly combed, his posture was commanding, and behind him stood several executives and legal advisors. The room was frozen in shock. Vanessa's face turned pale. One of the executives stepped forward and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Edward Whitmore, founder and chairman of Whitmore Global Holdings." Gasps filled the room. Whitmore Global Holdings was one of the most powerful investment firms in America, and Edward Whitmore was worth over $3 billion. Vanessa could barely breathe, her hands trembled. This was the investor, the very man she had humiliated and thrown into the rain. Edward slowly walked toward her, his face calm, his expression unreadable. Vanessa forced a nervous smile. "Mr. Whitmore, I had no idea." He raised his hand, stopping her. Then he turned to the crowd. "Before I invest in any business," he said firmly, "I conduct a private character test." The room went silent. He continued, "I disguise myself and approach the business as someone in need. Because true greatness is not measured by profit, but by compassion." Vanessa's knees nearly gave out. Edward looked directly into her eyes. "Tonight, Miss Carter, you failed that test." The silence was crushing. Then Edward reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. He placed it on the table in front of her. Vanessa stared at it, confused. "What is this?" she whispered. Edward replied, "It's the ownership transfer agreement." The room gasped again. Vanessa looked up in disbelief. Edward's voice remained calm. "Years ago, your father borrowed money from my company to save this restaurant. Hidden in that agreement was a clause allowing ownership review if ethical violations damaged the business's integrity. Vanessa's face drained of color, and after tonight, Edward said, that clause has been activated. She shook her head frantically. No, please. There must be some mistake. For the first time all night, Vanessa's arrogance shattered, tears filled her eyes, she dropped to her knees in front of him. Please. I'm begging you. Don't do this. The same woman who had mocked a desperate man minutes earlier was now pleading for mercy. Edward looked down at her, then he said the words she would never forget. The kindness you refuse to give is the mercy you now seek. He turned toward the staff, many of them looked relieved. Then he made his final announcement, effective immediately, this restaurant will be placed under new management. Vanessa sobbed, but Edward wasn't finished. He turned to the head chef, a humble man named Marcus, who had quietly spent years feeding homeless people with leftover food after every shift. Edward smiled. Marcus. The restaurant is now yours to run. The room erupted in applause. Marcus stood frozen in disbelief, tears streamed down his face, and for the first time, La Belle Maison became known not just for luxury, but for compassion. As for Vanessa, she walked out into the cold rain alone. And standing across the street, she saw a line of homeless people being welcomed into the restaurant for a free meal. Edward looked at her one final time and said, never judge a person by how they appear. Because the greatest lesson in life often arrives disguised as the least expected visitor. And that night, Vanessa learned that one cruel moment can destroy everything, but one act of kindness can change countless lives forever. If this story touched your heart, remember this. Kindness costs nothing. But its absence can cost everything.